Greetings. This is Dr. Luther Smith of the Renewed Mind podcast. We have a small favor to ask. We're seeking advocates who recognize the value of the program and wish to support us. If you enjoy our content, please hit the subscribe or like button or even the heart icon on your preferred platforms. This lets us know that you appreciate the information that we bring to you on the New Mind podcast. Additionally, if you think your friends or family would find our podcast interesting or helpful, maybe even entertaining, we seek to entertain here, please share our episodes with them as well. This is another fantastic way to advocate for the information that we bring to you. Our goal is to gather at least 500 advocates across all platforms by the end of this year. That is a lofty goal, and we know that. However, with your support, we can reach more people in this particular subject of counseling biblically and amplify the discussions and the topics that we explore here on the New Mind podcast. Thank you once again for listening. Grace and peace to you. And now let's dive into the podcast. You mentioned that sometimes the theological implications, they can't be heard right away. Well, there's a reason for that, is because when a person is overwhelmed with grief and sorrow, they're not able to process that information at that particular time. It's not that they don't find it important. It's just not in their purview right now. You know what I'm saying? And so to meet them where they're at, rather than giving them a theological treatise on things, to have them just kind of process it as it comes, is very helpful for them, because maybe they need just a person there to again understand where they're at the moment, rather than giving them just oh, well, don't worry, you'll be all right, or God is still good, he's still on the throne, he's still reigning, and all that stuff. As we mentioned before, that's true, but that's not what I need right now. Good theology misapplied is still bad theology.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to The Renewed Mind, the podcast where we explore the world of biblical counseling and bridge the gap to a more holistic understanding of how scripture, psychology, and counseling intersect. The Renewed Mind is here to provide insightful discussions, interviews, and transformative ideas that align with the wisdom of scripture. And now your hosts, Dr. Luther Smith and Madeline Clark.
Hello. Well, we are on episode 6, and you're still around, and you're still here. That's a great thing. Welcome to the Renewed Mind podcast. We are your hosts. My name is Dr. Luther Smith.
And my name is Maddie Clark, and welcome to the Renewed Mind podcast. Thanks for listening.
We have been talking for the past 5 episodes about basically the philosophy of counseling biblically. We've been telling you that this is a biblical counseling podcast, and it is, right? But it was important for us to really kind of underscore the foundational kind of presuppositions and things that we believe that biblical counseling ought to be. The last episode, we kind of explored the book Philosophical Foundations of Counseling Biblically. We explored chapter 1. And we looked at what what truth was, how truth is defined, right? That it is those things that correspond with reality, or as Madeline likes to say, it's reality revealed, right? Because God is the source of reality. He's created reality. He is the source of truth. And so he's created everything to work in accordance with his nature. And he's given us information that aligns with what's in accordance with what's real. And of course, he is the source of it. It's not that reality exists outside of himself. He has created reality from his nature. We also explored the source of authority again, and how, since God has revealed himself, or better yet, his character, his attributes in nature, and how he's revealed himself through human authors by his word, that he is the primo authoritative source on what's true, and that we ought to look at his insight, his information that he has provided as the primary source of what's real. After that, we kind of looked at 2 different perspectives. One was of the biblical infusion perspective, and how taking out of context scriptures and trying to pigeonhole theories or pigeonhole even theological perspectives do not align with reality. They don't, right? Because those verses are being taken out of context for the mere purpose of trying to make a point about a particular theory or a particular theological position, or what we talked about as the traditions of men, whether it be in any subject, right? Not just theology, but anthropology, sociology, and psychology, which is our focus, right? And then lastly, we talked about the authoritative foundational perspective, that one ought to look at what source of authority is governing a subject and see whether or not that source of authority aligns with the source of authority, that is scripture, right? And that's a better way of navigating that particular thing. We're actually going to take a hard right. And this is our Q&A episode where, as a matter of fact, just to give just some history, Maddie, Madeline, about this podcast actually started from these particular discussions that we've had over the course of several weeks. We used to meet every couple of weeks, and Maddie, Madeline had some questions concerning biblical counseling and topics and things like that. And we would go through, answering questions, gathering insights, looking at the scriptures, looking at how these things connect. And we decided to start a podcast based upon this particular thing. So the Q&A has some history with the Renewed Mind podcast, as this has kind of been kind of the inspiration as to start this particular project. So this is a great thing.
I thoroughly have always enjoyed picking Dr. Smith's brain and trying to ultimately, both of us together, ending up kind of picking the Word of God and really understanding lots of these different biblical counseling topics. And I want to bring that kind of conversation into what we do on this podcast, so you guys can kind of be privy to what it's like off camera, and off audio recording. Today, I thought it could be a cool little thought experiment, but also genuinely beneficial on my part, not gonna lie, but to do a little bit of a case study per se, except it being kind of almost a personal case study on my side of things.
This could be risky. This could be risky.
This could be really risky. Yeah.
We have no notes. We had something planned else, and now we're switching. So we have no notes for this. So we'll see how this goes.
I threw one from left field to Dr. Smith, and we'll see where it comes and how it goes. So this could either be terrible or this could be awesome. But I'm anticipating it actually being really beneficial and really fruitful. We talk about all the time that this is the most effective way to counsel individuals. And we say that often. We repeat ourselves in that way. We speak with authority, no pun intended, but the authority of the Word of God, on the fact that this is an effective counseling method. And I think it could be beneficial for our listeners and our viewers to maybe have a little bit of a window into what does a session look like when processing grief. Specifically is what we're going to be talking about today, processing grief. But what does a session, what kind of would that look like using the biblical authoritative foundational model method in counseling from a biblical perspective, in specifically the context of grief, because that is something that is imminent and going on personally in my life right now. And so I kind of, as you're listening to this and as you're watching this, I want you to kind of picture almost in essence Dr. Smith as maybe the counselor in this situation and myself as the client, although I probably will also add some additional commentary as a co-host to a podcast, since that is what my current spot is in. But I want you guys to maybe have an example of how this can look and how beneficial this methodology can actually be.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and begin to unpack kind of the subject of why we're talking about this. We're going to be looking today at kind of grief and loss, and how to kind of navigate through this, looking at the biblical perspective. Like I said, we've been talking about the philosophy of counseling kind of this whole time, and kind of piecing it together with this particular topic and this subject. Before we get started, though, and kind of go into what it looks like biblically to counsel from this perspective, Maddie, Madeline, tell us a little bit about the presenting problem that's on the table. Keep going.
So I I have a group of friends who we're all very close, very tight with each other. There's probably about 10 of us in this group. And one of my very close friends, a couple of months ago, ended up passing away. And she struggled pretty severely with some mental health challenges. In so doing, we had the intuition, some of my friends, my brother-in-law, some of my other friends, had the intuition to go ahead and do a wellness check on her. And when they went to go ahead and do this wellness check, before waiting for the police to come, they ended up walking in and realizing that she had passed away. There's a lot of fear, there was a lot of sadness, there was a lot of grief. That actually was not when I found out. I had just gotten home from work, and when I got home from work, my mom and my sister called me, and they were like, "Hey, we need to come over." And I was like, "Okay, what's going on?" And she goes, "Well, we think that Rachel may have taken her own life." And that hit so hard, and that hit very deeply. Thankfully, we found out that that's not what happened. She did not end up taking her own life. It ended up being kind of a freak medical incident that is super rare and unbeknownst. I've gone through school, I've gone through counseling school to a degree. Haven't obviously, I'm not completely done with learning these things. No one ever really is. But it's one thing to read about grief and read about loss and even read about the biblical perspective on those things. And then it's another thing to experience it directly with someone that you're super close with. You know, they say that grief doesn't really leave you all like completely. And I'm starting to experience what that means. You know, thinking about her just randomly while I'm typing in some things at work and realizing that there's something there that still kind of bothers me about it, and I haven't quite worked those pieces out.
Yeah, when it comes to grief and loss, by the way, this particular practice is outlined in a book called Foundations for Counseling Biblically. And so we'll kind of be walking through this as we're kind of examining the steps that are outlined in that book with Maddie Madeline's kind of presentation here. So the first thing, it's called the 4 C's, and each C has a particular different focus. And we'll talk about where kind of the biblical precedent comes from that. Let's talk about the first C. So the first C here is to collect information. If you notice, when the question that I asked, or the statement that I asked, is, can you please tell me a little bit about the presenting problem and what's going on, and tell me a little bit about why, we're examining this. That is for the purpose of me collecting information to make a proper assessment concerning Maddie Madeline's particular perspective, that this individual that she has described is very close. You said a group of about 10, right? And that they were very, very close and very tight knit, right? And that there ended up being some type of fluke accident, right? Now, if I was, again, counseling her, I would that would bring some questions into my mind as to what sort of fluke accident. Do you know what happened to her specifically? Do you have any more details on that? Right, things like that. That brings up questions into my mind as to how that is. She got a call from, I believe it was your mother, and I would presume too that they were, of course, distraught. Let me ask you a question. Again, this is kind of the first C of collecting. When you first found out about your close friend passing away, how did you feel? What were kind of your first responses?
It wasn't a response that I thought I would give. I thought that maybe, in hindsight, if something had like this, absolutely painful like that had happened to me, I would have assumed I would have just fallen apart and started bawling. My sister and my mom by the time they had told me, ended up coming over to my house. And my sister is telling me this, and she is very distraught and she's very emotional. And so actually my direct response immediately was to do whatever I needed to do to care for her and to figure out how to help her with processing all of whatever the questions that she had for her. So in the moment, I actually was like almost more focused, but I've noticed that it's probably bothered me more in the like last month or so than it did when it first happened. When it first happened, I just kind of went into action. I was like, yeah, okay, this is kind of an emergency. This is definitely an emergency situation here. Let me focus in on how can I help the people around me.
So now that, by the way, thanks for sharing that, by the way. So if you notice, again, asking questions, collecting information is very, very important, right? It's important because that's part of the means by which a counselee is heard and understood, right? And the more questions that we can gather. Now, again, some of the questions that I might ask are very benign, right? Like, how old was she when she passed? And things like that. Like, how close were you guys, right? Did you guys do everything together? Did you guys, do family outings and things like that, right? These questions may be benign on the surface, but there's a particular reason why I'm asking these, to gather data and to also connect with the counselee. There are particular scriptures that go along with this before we begin to kind of roll through this. One such scripture that talks about or underscores collecting data is found in 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13. Just this is one sentence or one statement of Paul, but this statement has an implication in there. It says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep," all right, so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. Now, how is collecting data associated with this, right? Well, Paul, remember, if you remember Thessalonica, we talked about the region of Thessalonica when we talked about 1 Thessalonians 5, and that the saints of Thessalonica were experiencing lots of loss, lots of loss, not by means of a medical fluke accident, but lots of loss due to the fact that there was heavy persecution. As a matter of fact, in the book of Acts, Paul had to leave this region at night because of all of the hostility that was there. So could you imagine him leaving there, but those believers remaining there, right? And having to live and work in that particular area. And so there was a lot of persecution, a lot of individuals who were losing their lives or being, beaten profusely because of this. He mentions here in verse 13, "For I do not want you to be uninformed." The reason why he says this is because he has knowledge of their state. That's why. So he's literally taking his time to focus on a particular thing that either he's seen or he has heard based upon information. He's collected this information. You can't really do anything. This is kind of the first step whenever you're dealing with any type of counseling situation, but particularly with grief. The more information that you can collect on your counseling, the more you're able to address them specifically based upon that information, like Paul is doing here, that he doesn't want them to be uninformed. So that's the first step, is to collect. The second step is known as connect. Okay, so there are 4 C's. The first one is collect, and the second one is connect. Now, this can also be underscored in 1 Thessalonians 4 too, but I also want to underscore this in Romans 12, verses 9 to 13. It says, "Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor, not lacking behind in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, persevering in tribulation, devoted to prayer, contributing to the needs of the saints, practicing hospitality." Here's the part here, verses 14 and 15. "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep." In this particular context here, we have Paul writing basically about the conduct of the saints in relation to God's mercy. We talked about this when we did Romans 12, 1-4, that everything that we do comes out of who we are and who we understand others are. In this text here, Paul basically says to rejoice with those who rejoice, to celebrate, to be in that state when a person is in that state, but also when a person is weeping or when a person is experiencing heavy grief or overwhelming sense, that we are to share that same connection. So the questions that I asked Maddie Madeline, even if they're benign in nature or what we would perceive to be benign, they are meant for me to connect with her given that situation, in which I can respond to her when she said, well, I was kind of surprised, or I was kind of shocked by how I responded. Based upon the information that she shared with me, I would respond in this way. Maddie Madeline, it's really normal for people to grieve in different ways. Some people grieve instantly. They hear the news about a close friend and the companion, and they instantly disintegrate because of that connection that one has. Some people insulate. They don't break down, but they just kind of are in themselves, right? And kind of processing it kind of internally. Some people are just shocked. They can't believe it, right? I need to see. I need to make a call. I need to, do this. Some people respond in that way. Some people also respond by wanting to help others, particularly if they have family members or friends that are more overwhelmed than they are. You had mentioned, Maddie Madeline, too, that you didn't really feel it right away, but now over the course of the months, you've been kind of identifying with that, connecting with that. It is very, very common, very, very common, particularly in your case, when you're worried about other individuals, to put your emotional kind of processing aside. As a matter of fact, here's a question that I have for you. Are you the type of person that really does that often? That you kind of look to others, like, if they're kind of feeling down, if you're feeling down, you kind of put your kind of emotional state aside to kind of help them?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I definitely have that habit.
Yeah.
And my first response is, and it's actually been advantageous because there's a lot of situations where anxiety is not going to be the helpful thing, or fear is not going to be the helpful thing, but
Mhm.
focus is the helpful thing. So yeah, that's definitely like, it almost feels like the more tragic a situation is, the more focused I become.
Now, if this were a session, I could bring this up somewhat as a strength and somewhat as a limitation. So I could say to Maddie Madeline, I could say, one of the things that makes that really cool is in a crisis situation, you remain focused. So, if there was something that happened, a tragedy at hand or something like that, you can kind of keep those, the people together, right? By the way, are you a firstborn?
No, I'm not actually.
Or
I'm the baby.
you're the baby. Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. So that's kind of interesting too. But working through this, that's a strength of yours, that when everybody else is kind of lost it, or is kind of processing things, right? You're able to kind of pull things together. But at the same time too, that may be a limitation, because if you continue to do that, right, particularly in a crisis situation that's personal to you, you could very well end up prolonging your grief. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, that sounds 100% accurate.
Okay. So, which is why, again, you're kind of noticing now that, the dust is kind of settling and things like that. And everyone's kind of leveling out based upon the help that you've provided and things like that. You're beginning to start to, oh man, I'm thinking about her when I'm doing this, or, I'm thinking about her when I'm washing dishes, or, something like that, because now it's time to process a little bit for you now. Notice what I just did. I did the 2 C's right there. I collected information based upon the questions I asked. And again, no question is good or bad. Okay. All questions are designed to draw out the information for the presenting problem that Maddie Madeline has addressed. Another reason why I'm asking questions is not only to collect data, but to use that to connect with her. Okay. Concerning her presenting problem. One of the things in the counseling process is trust. That is the glue in the counseling process. If we don't have trust, if Madeline did not trust me, I would not be able to move anywhere with her because of the fact that she doesn't have any confidence that I'm going to help her with the presenting problem for whatever reason, right? So the counseling process is the trust is the glue that makes the counseling process possible. How do we build trust? We build trust by asking questions, gaining information, and using those questions to connect. Now, Madeline, just for the sake of our viewers here, if you were to, I know this is kind of a basic thing, we're not going too deep in the weeds, but based upon my approach to you, would you say that you feel or that you are experiencing confidence in the process, or are you not confident in the process so far?
The more questions, and obviously since this is on a podcast, we're limited on the number of words that we can even use in an hour, where an actual counseling session would not have, let me explain to you my every step to it. And so, but every time you ask a question, I feel the urge to then draw more information out and explore inside of my own mind. Oh, like imagining different times when I have, been in other crisis situations and immediately felt like I needed the caretake. And it is definitely like making my mind go through the exploration stage a little bit of thinking through other instances, but also, creating more questions in my mind regarding the topic of loss and losing this individual. And yeah, it definitely feels connected. And you've done it too off camera a number of times. And I can tell you that it also feels that builds connection as well.
Well, that's nice. Another question that we could ask to kind of collect more data and gain more information is, as she is beginning to start to remember some of those things, some of those instances, we can ask her, so what do you use, or how do you process grief and loss from your perspective? That gives us again some more insight into how she would, if she's done it in the past, and if she has done it in the past, what has she done, and has it been effective? So the first two C's are collect and connect, right? Collect information. Now, normally this happens and occurs on an intake form, but for a counselor working from a biblical position, again, I don't want to see my counselee as an intake form. I want to see my counselee as a human being made in the image of God. And so I'm going to take that information from the intake form, and I'm going to ask more questions on that, expand on that, right? But even if I don't have an intake form, I still want to start by doing that, collecting information and using those questions and that information to connect with the counselee. Let's talk about the third one. And the third one is going to take a little bit while to unpack, because there's within this particular third step, there are kind of subsets or substeps, and there's a couple of distinctions we need to make. So after you collect the data, or actually you'll be kind of collecting throughout the process, it doesn't just stop. And after you're connecting with them, again, connection just doesn't happen. It's not a one-time thing. You're always doing this, right? With every session that you have, you want to comfort. So collect, connect, and comfort. This is also found in 1 Thessalonians 4. Paul writes this. He goes, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, that is, those who have died." That's a euphemism for dying. "So that you will not grieve as the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus." Notice that Paul is writing based upon the information he's collected, and he's using this information that he's collected to address this specific issue, particularly of the saints in Thessalonica. He says, "I do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve as the rest who have no hope." Notice that Paul does not write that you don't grieve at all. And notice that this grief isn't specific either. As you grieve and cry and wail and moan, He doesn't give any specifics. To grieve again is to be heavy laden, to pant, right? To be overwhelmed, right? And there are many individuals who grieve differently. As Maddie Madeline mentioned before, she didn't, cry or wail or anything else like that. But now she's, afterwards she's starting to get those memories and those feelings, and they're touching her a little bit. But notice that Paul does not say, do not grieve at all. He does not say that, because grief on this side of reality is part of the human experience. In this case, Paul is addressing those who have been persecuted and they're losing family members, right? That was indicative to their situation. But at the same time, though, we find that people grieve for all sorts of reasons. As we mentioned, Maddie Madeline mentioned before, she had a best friend who died because of a medical mix-up, and she passed away. There are people who pass away because of they unalive themselves. There are people that pass away because of natural causes. There are people that pass away because we call it the heartbreak syndrome. They've been married for 50 years. One of them passes away, and then they suddenly pass away after that. There's many reasons why individuals pass. And that brings grief to those who are connected to them. So one of the things, as this relates to Maddie Madeline's situation, is as me as a counselor, me connecting and feeling empathic towards her, to acknowledge that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for your loss, irrespective of whether or not she's crying in front of me or not. I don't need a reaction from her to be empathetic, to understand, wow, that, tell me how hard that is. Now that you're thinking about her, and kind of, the memory of her comes in your mind. Tell me how you're feeling about that. Is do you not feel anything? Do you feel something? Is it shocking you? Tell me a little bit about that.
It's hard. It's definitely hard. And it is surprising. And I think you asked, how do I deal with, how have I dealt with grief in the past? And most of the time, or at least maybe not, I haven't necessarily dealt with the loss of a loved one, as far as in death, but there's been loss that I've had in my life in other circumstances, as far as like losing relationships. But this is still different. Like the loss of someone in life is different. I generally cope with things by trying to think through them and trying to understand them. It's been really tough to try to understand how someone who was literally just at my graduation party 3 days later is not here. I don't understand. I can't understand that. And I think that is extremely challenging to try to deal with that. Like even just the idea of like, okay, you say we don't grieve as the world grieves, we grieve as those who hope, but what is the hope in, right? Like we don't know if this person was saved or not. And so sometimes the hope is like, I think as Christians, we generally think of the hope being, well, the hope is, oh, I'll get to see the person again because they'll be in heaven and I'll be in heaven. Which is the case for a lot of people and could be the case for this individual, but we just don't know. And so there's a lot of like fear and sadness there as well. So anyway, there's a lot of words that I just used there, but
yes, and this goes into the other subset that we have to talk about. So oftentimes as believers in Christ, because we're looking for the best intentions to really try to comfort the person that's in front of us, and particularly biblical counselors are working from a biblical worldview, we want to operate out of the truth always. But when you have an individual, particularly a counselee, who does not know or is not sure of the person's state after they've passed, the one thing that we do not want to do, actually there's two things. The one thing that we do not want to do is just go, oh, I'm sure that they're in heaven. I'm sure that they're okay. We don't want to do that. And the reason is because we don't know. We don't know either. We're saying those things because we don't want the counselee to feel that pain, that loss, so we don't know either. That's one thing that we ought to put aside. The second thing is, as counselors, again, working from a biblical perspective, we do want to bring the truth. Like there's some really good truth here in 1 Thessalonians 4. But the counselee who may be grieving may not be ready or prepared to hear that yet. We have to work with the counselee in that present moment. How would I do this? Well, now that Maddie Madeline has expressed that, I would be like, I would say something to the effect of like this, Maddie Madeline, I can understand how hard it is that you not only lost a close friend, but you don't even know if they're in the presence of the Lord or not. And I would say, would you say that that kind of is kind of causing a little bit of that angst, that anxiety that you feel?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh man, I'm sorry, because it's almost kind of like a double dose, a double hit. You've lost this friend, and you're not even sure whether or not they're there where you'll be or not. That's sad. That's hard. That's a part of connecting and comforting that individual, is understanding them, right? Not trying to answer they may not even want that, right? They're just kind of processing this like, hey, this is hard for me. Here's another subset of comfort as well. You have to gauge where they are at the moment. So let me recap what you said, and then let's talk a little bit more. So your best friend died, she passed away, and you're basically grieved about twice concerning this issue. One of them is the fact that she's gone. You won't be able to call her. You won't be able to visit her. And she was extremely close to your family. And part of that is being unsure that she's basically in the presence of the Lord in glory. And that causes a lot of consternation, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiousness. Now, I don't know where she's at either. Let me ask you a question. What are some of the things in her life, who she is, that made you guys connect as best friends?
Mm.
She was here.
She was probably one of like, we've been talking about how important it is to be empathetic. She was one of the most empathetic people that I knew.
Mm.
She also knew no one that she couldn't get along with, or rather couldn't get along with her. She was just an incredibly kind soul, who was always there, and she had her own struggles, but at the same time, like, she, in any moment's notice, as long as you were available and she was available, she would be there for whatever. And that's like a cliche that people say all the time, like, oh, that person's just really reliable. No, like, she genuinely would just be there for you. And she would sit and listen till 2 o'clock in the morning if she had to. She'd sleep on your couch so she could listen to you until all hours of the night, and then just crash on your couch later that evening. And so she just was incredibly kind, incredibly caring soul, incredibly empathetic, gentle, understanding, really just such a sweet person.
That's great information. Again, asking the question and collecting more data about the nature and character of this person. So notice what I did. Since she doesn't know where her eternal state is, and I don't know where her internal state is, we can't have any certainty there. And that's okay.
Mm,
But where can we have certainty? In the fact that this girl, this one best friend who she lost, impacted her in a positive
mm,
way. That is the glue. That is the connection that's going to help her throughout this grieving process. That's
mm,
what we want to build on. Not where she is now, because again, we don't know, but how she impacted Maddie Madeline. That she talked about how empathetic she was, and how compassionate she was, and how dedicated she was. And we can also tie this back in to the fact that this woman, even though we don't know where she is, we're uncertain of that, but we can tie this back in that we are certain that she was made in the image of God. Even though she might have not recognized it, or she expressed it through how she interacted with Maddie Madeline and her family. That she was caring, she was compassionate, she was sweet. That there was no one that didn't get along with her, right? Who knew.
mm,
Those are the things that you want to remember. Also, too, we can connect this back to a practical thing that we do in our lives. For example, if Maddie Madeline was my counselee and I was asking her, I can ask her a couple of things. I can ask her, how does the grieving process that you go through will help you get through this, right? This particular situation. I could ask her, how could focusing on the things that this, her friend, by the way, what is her name?
Rachel.
Rachel. So focusing on Rachel's character and quality and who she was. How will that help assist her in comforting her within her grief? Notice I didn't say remove it. I said comforting her within her grief. This goes back to the last C. We'll get to that in a minute. Or I can introduce something new, like a technique or a skill. So let's say this. Remember, our goal for a person who is small-souled, and this is a positional thing, not just an emotional thing. Okay, I would say that Maddie Madeline, would you agree that in some respects you are small-souled in
Yes.
this particular area? So one of the things we want to do is offer strength. So what I would do as an intervention or an exercise is, the cool thing about photo albums is that people never put bad or awful things in a photo album. They put good things, good situations in a photo album, because whenever we are down, those things that we put in a photo album get us from one happy snapshot to the next. It causes us to focus on those things that are beneficial for us. It centers us. That's the one thing about photo albums. Now, way back when, they didn't have photo albums, so what would they use? Stories of individuals. I mean, we still use them. We just have images to go with them. Do you have a photo album of this woman, Rachel?
Yeah, I have a bunch of photos of her on my Amazon photos that swipe through my Alexa and my TV. And she comes up quite often, and I find myself, I find people asking me when they're over at my house about her or whoever's in that picture, and getting to tell stories, actually.
Mm. And what does that do when you tell stories, particularly stories about her that you guys love and appreciate?
It's kind of bittersweet.
Mhm.
I Sometimes it just really chokes me up and it gets me, because there's like a sense of beauty and delight of remembering like the things that we spent time doing and the times that we had together. But then like there's like a sadness because we don't get to do that anymore. And she will never sit on my couch, or she'll never, crash on my couch again, or she'll never, I will never go on a coffee date again, or whatever the
Mhm.
picture happens to be of.
So going back to our particular steps, this is how we're doing all three now: collecting, connecting, and comforting. So I asked a question, collected data. Now I'm going to connect with her based upon what she said. Maddie Madeline, that is the nature of the world we live in, right? And that is the nature of the human experience, right? That what you expressed to me just now was, how one feels when they've lost a loved one, and how grief doesn't go away just like that, but that particularly the closer we are to them, the longer it takes to
Mm,
kind of process that. Sometimes, you're left with the scar, right? And the deeper the cut, the more prominent the scar, right? We'll kind of
mm,
think of when a death of a loved one as a deep, deep cut. That scar will always be there. But over time, you'll be, instead of going, oh man, that hurts, you'll be able to look at it and go, man, that was a really prominent scar, or that was a really
mm,
deep cut. It won't impact you as much, but it'll still be there. The goal is not to take away the grief. The goal is to help you process through it. Would you be willing, and I would share this if she was my counselor, would you be willing to perhaps maybe make a collage or a montage of Rachel, and
mhm,
maybe perhaps create it, build it, make it nice, like you take a cork board. Maybe you can go down to Tuesday Morning or something like that, or Hobby Lobby, right, and grab some things, right, and create a cork board or some type of board or mural for her to remember her attributes, the character, the qualities that she had that everyone recognized, and how you having those qualities too is almost in a sense kind of honoring her and kind of remembering her. That leads us to the last C, and that is continue. Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4, after he writes the information that they need, telling them about the resurrection, that those who are in Christ who have fallen asleep, they will be resurrected because that's what they needed based upon their situation. He writes this in verse 16. He says, therefore, comfort one another with these words. The objective for Paul was, did he want them to know the doctrine? Well, they already knew it, right? Did he want them to know the instruction? Well, they already knew it. He taught them. Why did he want them to remind one another of these words? For comfort. That's the point. Not for them to, get an A on their theology exam. But for the mere purpose was to give them comfort, because even when after Paul wrote this, they continued to deal with loss and grief. That's the point. And so to remind Madeline that, this grief may continue for a while. How you feel, these thoughts and these memories will continue for a while. Let's talk about how when they do continue, when you feel that sting, which by the way is, I wouldn't say it's a great thing, but that shows us the nature of death, that this is unnatural, that something is off, that it's not meant to be this way. Even if she was a believer, let's say that. Paul writes, they're believers, and yet they're still grieving. They're still grieving the loss. It's not that they don't know. He taught them. He says, I don't want you to be uninformed. But the point is, the grief is going to continue. So what do? You process it. It's the same thing here. So if she was my counselee and we were working through things, of course, of course, we only got a brief amount of time, but I would basically say, Madeline, would you be willing to build a mural and maybe perhaps have the 10 that were there and have like maybe a remembrance time, an hour or two where you guys sit and talk about her, and talk about how she impacted, your life and the lives of others and stuff, and just kind of set that mural kind of in the center of the room or somewhere, in the front and things like that. And just share stories. If you need to weep. If you need, a shoulder to cry on, to do that, and just have a time where you're able to connect. Would that be something that you would be interested in?
I can see how that could be beneficial for everyone else as well. Because me experiencing this makes me wonder if maybe other people are too still, and that the initial sting is not over for everyone else.
Yeah, that's a great thing. Just to recap the 4 C's. One is to collect information. You can't really counsel if you have no information. I mean, we work off of information. That's very important. But not only the information, but to connect, to use it to express empathy, connect, build trust with our counselees. That is important. And to comfort. That's the main reason. We see this in 1 Thessalonians 5 with encouraging the faint-hearted or the small-souled. We see it here in 1 Thessalonians 4. I find it to be very fascinating that the passages that we looked at that express comfort the most is this one, and to weep with those who weep, which is important, which is another aspect of comfort. And then to continue to understand that grief and loss, they don't just go away, even when we want them to, but to understand that this is a part of the human experience, to acknowledge that, I don't want to say normalize it, but to acknowledge it and to recognize it, and to offer solutions that help that individual process it in a manner that is manageable for them.
Mm.
So that's kind of the basic kind of understanding of the 4 C's and how they would work in a counseling setting. Now, of course, the counselee is always the one who evaluates the counselor, not the other way around. So, Maddie, Madeline, your thoughts? How did I do as a counselor trying to express these 4 C's?
I found the reminders very insightful of thinking through how, being reminded that this is on this side of heaven, a normal process, and that this is to be expected, but also that this is not the way that it was meant to be, and that dealing with grief is going to look different for absolutely everybody. And that as counselors, remembering to not insert ourselves into or our discomfort. Maybe this person, the person is highly emotional or is, expressing a lot, to remember that, like, I need to sit there and I need to be present with them and I need to ask them questions so that I can understand them and so that I can connect with them and so that I can comfort them, because those are going to be it's crazy how God created us. Like, weep with those who weep doesn't mean go and tell this person all of the things that are theological implications of their situation. Even though, maybe later on, further down the road, maybe years later, that might be questions that they may have come up and they've experienced it and it's more of a scar, like you were saying. But when the feelings are real and the feelings are there and the feelings are raw, your validation of me feeling the way that I'm feeling and being okay with the fact that this is okay and it's normal and there isn't any one way that I have to grieve was very comforting. And quite frankly, too, like, I don't even know if we had this conversation a couple months ago. I don't even know if I could have had a conversation with you in detail about any of those theological concepts, because the emotions was so high and so present that wouldn't have been a realistic possibility. And so I think being intuitive as a counselor to that as well, about where your client is on the spectrum of severity or acuity or how close they are to the situation, is also important, right? And you'll get all that from the collecting stage of understanding, oh, this happened a month ago. Okay, this is not, I'm not going to handle that person the same way that I would handle someone who had their mom or dad die 10 years ago. And that happens. We still have conversations as counselors with individuals whose parents died decades ago, and they're still dealing with pieces of it and little bitty bits of that scar, those remembrances of their loss, as well as the acute situations where it's more imminent. The pain is more imminent. But I really appreciate you walking through those steps, and I appreciate you making that process clear. I know the first time I learned the 4 C's of counseling, the 4 C's of comfort, it made a big difference in how I engaged with my friends, and even in this situation that I'm referring to with my friends, in the short time frame of immediately after finding out to comforting my friends. This is what I used. These 4 C's I had used enough, and they had become natural enough to be able to engage with them, with people who are in extremely acute pain, and they found it comforting, or at least I hope they did. No one ever told me they didn't. But I feel like this is an incredible tool in the toolbox of the counselors that I think, and also knowing that it comes from a very biblical perspective of, this is exactly how Paul handles grief and encourages the believers in Thessalonica and Colossae and Rome to grieve and to help assist their loved ones, or to, as we would say, encourage their small-hearted loved ones to grieve.
Yeah, this is it's a great passage. Good, a couple of statements of Paul, right? And again, I'm not doing this simply just because I'm a counselor as well, but I'm doing this because this is, again, we're striving to work out of our identity, out of who we are, right? And who we see others to be. That those who are counselees before us, they are made in God's image. We all have the sin nature, of course, but there are certain struggles, there are certain things, pressures, things that happen, right, that impact us on many levels. Another thing too, just to kind of another point, and then we'll kind of wrap this up, is you mentioned that sometimes the theological implications, they can't be heard right away. Well, there's a reason for that, is because when a person is overwhelmed with grief and sorrow, they're not able to process that information at that particular time. It's not that they don't find it important. It's just not in their purview right now. You know what I'm saying? And so to meet them where they're at, rather than giving them a theological treatise on things, to have them just kind of process it as it comes, is very helpful for them, right? Because maybe they need just a person there to, again, understand where they're at the moment, rather than giving them just, oh, well, don't worry, you'll be all right, or God is still good, he's still on the throne, he's still reigning, and all that stuff. As we mentioned before, that's true, but that's not what I need right now. Good theology misapplied is still bad theology.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So yes. By the way, that we are going to get T-shirts made for that particular statement. That is a fantastic statement. So I'm looking forward to that. You think I'm playing, but that's gonna be a T-shirt one day. This actually worked out very well. This was a great episode, and we hope that this is a toolbox that you can use, or a tool that you can use. You can put into your toolbox, and maybe you were already doing it, but you didn't have anything to put it towards or put it together, and so we hope that it's been enriching for you. First of all, we want to thank all of the listeners, all of the views, all of those who have become advocates by subscribing and following. If you're on Rumble as well, we appreciate each and every one of you guys, and we really, really do. We did not expect it to grow this much. We just thought we just occupy this little corner with maybe 5 people. It has been incredible, the views and the encouragement that we've gotten from everybody. And we encourage you guys to join the discussion as well. This is a little longer than our usual episodes, but we thought that this warranted the time. So if you want to comment, you can please comment down below any thoughts that you have about what I shared, what Maddie Madeline shared, maybe even some insights just about the 4 C's and what you thought about them. Please comment down below. You can also follow us on Facebook, The Renewed Mind. You can follow us on X at The Renewed Mind Podcast. I got a couple of cool statements on there that I've been putting up there. You can also follow us, of course, on Rumble and YouTube, and we are also available on all of the audio platforms, Spotify, Amazon Music. We're available on Apple. We look forward to even more episodes to give you, and we're still looking for 500 subscribers or 500 advocates. I don't know if we're going to make that, but we are looking for those as well to continue to amplify the discussions and the topics that we bring here on the Renewed Mind podcast. Any final thoughts, Maddie Madeline, concerning our episode? This was a great episode.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you having that conversation with me and processing through those pieces and providing those insights, but also just walking us through the 4 C's of comforting in the counseling environment. Thank you so much for that conversation. I look forward to our next conversation as well. That's going to be a major delight to get to have a conversation with your amazing wife.
Next episode, we will be interviewing my wife, who has experienced post-traumatic stress, and so we will be walking through that as well. That'll be a fun one as well to kind of unpack and see how she's experienced it. And how she's worked through this and continues to work through this, by the way. I'm looking forward to that as well. Again, thank you once again for listening and for watching. My name is Dr. Luther Smith.
And my name is Maddie Clark. Thank you for listening to the Renewed Mind podcast.
And we will catch you on the next episode. Grace and peace to you. Take care.